Good evening and welcome. It is a pleasure joining you this evening. It looks like folks are entering the room here. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome on this evening where there are a lot of other things going on. This is our fourth Habitat hosted by McKenzie River Trust, fish recovery and recent delistings under the Federal Endangered Species Act in Oregon with Brian Bangs. My name is Holly McCrae and I am the Events and Outreach Manager for McKenzie River Trust, and it's such a pleasure to join you this evening. I know right now many of us are pretty familiar with Zoom, but just a few things on that. When you entered the webinar, the system automatically put you on mute and turned off your webcam. So you are in a view only, listen only mode. After Brian's presentation, we'll have some time for questions and answers. And so to submit a question, you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can submit those at any time during the presentation. And at the end, we'll go through those, and we may not have time for all of them, but we'll certainly do our best to get through those questions. And if you have to leave the presentation for any reason or have technical difficulties, I'll be sending out a link with a recording to tonight's presentation so that you can view it later. Before we begin the program this evening, I want to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous people who stewarded the lands we are on today for many generations before us. Colonization by white settlers drove most Indigenous people away from their homelands, usually by force or coercion. It's important to acknowledge our past so that we can work towards a more just and equitable future. Our projects and service areas include the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya, Siletz, Coos, Lower Umpqua, Siuslaw, Molalla, and other bands and tribes. Today, many of their descendants are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. Please take a moment now to reflect on where you are sitting tonight or where you call home and honor those who cared for the land before you. Thank you. We understand that having a role in land ownership means we have a responsibility to those whose lands we have stolen them from. The land calls us to commit to continue learning how to be better stewards of the land, as well as better allies to all of the people that inhabit it. I know many of you who are attending tonight are friends and members of McKenzie River Trust. Please know that we appreciate your support and really miss seeing you all in person. And for those of you who are new to McKenzie River Trust, we welcome you. We are a nonprofit land trust that works to protect the lands and rivers we love in Western Lane County. We have about 6,700 acres of land under our management from the Cascades to the coast. Throughout the year, we're engaged in restoration and stewardship activities, and we provide volunteer opportunities for those wanting to get their hands dirty to help us achieve our work. And in non-COVID years, we offer tours and educational opportunities on the land. If you'd like to join us, a gift of any size makes you a member, and I will post a link in the chat box tonight if you would like to join us as a McKenzie River Trust member. I am very excited about tonight's presentation. For one, in the conservation world, Brian Bangs is kind of a rock star, and I always appreciate any time I get to spend learning from him. And second, I, like many, are in need of some good news. Wildlife populations have declined by 68% since 1970 as a result of overconsumption, population growth, and intensive farming, which is further evidence that humans have unleashed the sixth mass extinction. News like this is heartbreaking and can even be paralyzing, but there are success stories, and it is important to learn from those who have had a role in these successful conservation efforts. So let me tell you about Brian. For over 15 years, Brian was a fish biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife with the Native Fish Investigations Program. He's just taken on a new position with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Aquatics Division. Much of Brian's focus has been the research and conservation of Oregon's resident non-game fish species, primarily Oregon Chub, as well as Pacific and brook lamprey, sand roller, Great Basin redband trout, and the Alvord Chub. At McKenzie River Trust, if you mention Brian's name in a staff meeting, there was always this collective, Brian, he's the best. And he is. So Brian, I'm going to let you take it from here. And please remember, if during the program you have questions, be sure to type those into the Q&A box. Brian, it's all you.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm sitting over here laughing. I'm going to just take a second to get going here, everyone. I'm going to share this one, and then I'm going to go like that. Okay, Holly, is that showing up okay?
Yep, it looks great.
Super. Yes, 3 weeks ago, I would have been Brian Bangs with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, as I had been for the last 16-ish years, and I just made a change. And in part because we've had a lot of success with a number of these species we've been working with and are looking to replicate the success elsewhere. And so Holly reached out to me, a while back over the late summer, and had asked, we're hoping to do these habitat talks, and what do you have? Do you have anything that might be of interest? And, at the time, I think it was before the fires even, but at the time I was thinking like, gosh, it's been kind of a rough year. And I have a success story to talk about. In fact, we have 4 success stories to talk about in Oregon, and they're pretty special ones. They're special to me, and I think they'll be special to you guys too at the end of our talk. And so happy to come in and share some good news, especially when it's kind of a busy night otherwise. I developed this talk in concert with Chris Allen, who's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's the program manager of the aquatics division. So I wanted to speak, and my 8-month-old puppy is in the background howling right now. So if you guys can hear that, I'm sorry. I wanted to talk briefly. I realized that in putting this talk together that I'm going to be talking a bit about the Act and about petitioning fish and delisting fish and recovery as an action, and not really talking about, well, what does this look like? And so when a species is at a point where there's concern for it, be it by special interest group, by biologists, by whomever, a petition can be put in to the Fish and Wildlife Service or to NOAA if it's an anadromous species to list the species under the ESA, under the Endangered Species Act. From there, it goes on to a listing assessment, and the outcome of the listing assessment can either be to put it into a threatened or endangered category, threatened being simply that it's going to become or likely to become endangered in the near future, and endangered being that it could become extinct in the near future based on the information we have available. Sometimes we receive so many listing petitions that they're put into this kind of candidate assessment, and we get to them in kind of a priority order as fast as we can. But they can go from this listing assessment back into that candidate pool, and oftentimes from the candidate pool to become kind of species of concern at that point, things that we're going to keep an eye on. So, but as a species, if they do make it to the threatened or endangered list, once they're on the list, that's when the recovery work happens. At this point, we're engaged in active conservation of the species, conserving both the species itself, the habitat, monitoring for and assessing threats to the species, trying to manage those threats, and overall conserve and recover the species. A lot of research happens at this point, a lot of that active management and the boots on the ground. When we say a fish or any species is on the endangered species list, it's this category right here that we're typically talking about. Although somewhat, it doesn't happen often. After this is where downlistings and delistings happen. Downlisting is for an endangered species that is doing well enough that it can be upgraded to threatened status, so that it's no longer at risk of imminent extinction. Numbers are going up, threats, the impact of threats are going down, and as a sign of, hey, the species is doing better, and it loosens up some of the regulations on the species, it becomes downlisted to threatened status. It can also, if it's doing really well, be delisted, either from threatened status or from endangered status. And after that, there's a post-delisting monitoring period, and it's kind of the hand over the buzzer period. Like, we delisted the species, we think it no longer requires protection of the ESA. but we want to make sure uncertainty is always a piece of this, and we want to make sure, and so it can be quickly assessed again if threats become active and potentially put back on the list, or conservation things can happen kind of during that period. But it's a minimum of 5 years. Oftentimes they stretch more for a lot of our delisted species to see to make sure that the choice to delist was correct. So I oftentimes think of the Endangered Species Act a little bit like, and conservation in general, like healthcare. And the Endangered Species Act is like the emergency room. And it's like, ooh, you might die. You need help right this second. And we have the Endangered Species Act. And the emergency room in a hospital doesn't take the place of regular ongoing care. And you should have a doctor, and you should, you know, go in and get checkups. And we should have other ways of getting care that aren't the emergency room. And in a similar way, the Endangered Species Act isn't meant to be the be-all, end-all of this is how we conserve the environment, and this is how we conserve species, but it's a way to respond when species are doing really poorly. And so just a way to think about ESA. So this is kind of breaking it down by the numbers. This is the number of domestic species listed under the ESA, domestic meaning the non-anadromous species. 1,623 species currently listed under the ESA. That's plants, animals, mollusks, fish, you know, it's everything. 42, and I believe that number comes from a year or two ago, but 42 species so far have been recovered from the endangered species list. And since they were put on the list, 11 species have gone extinct. And 19 of them were delisted due to taxonomic error. Basically, we thought this was a different species, and we found out, no, it's the same as this other species, it just looks a little different. And they were delisted because of these kind of errors. And I'll use the word ESA quite a bit in this talk. And as I slowly become a federal employee, I'm going to probably pick up more and more acronyms, but ESA being the Federal Endangered Species Act. There's also a state of Oregon has an endangered species list, and I won't be talking about that here, but there is a state list that we use to kind of prioritize species in the state as well that need conservation. So federally listed species in Oregon between the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, which are anadromous species, 58 species in the state. And the list include, the fish on the list include species like Warner sucker, Tui chub, Hutton cutthroats, several of the Klamath suckers, and bull trout. A number of species have been delisted in Oregon. Of those, you know, a couple years ago, 42, I think it's about 50 now. The species have been delisted, include iconic bald eagles and brown pelicans, and these 4 fish that I'm going to talk about today. Of interest, a bulk of the species listed in Oregon are fish species, and aquatic habitats and fish habitats have a lot of impacts to them. You know, fish, this may surprise everyone, fish require water and typically require clean water and abundant water, and aquatic ecosystems themselves can be impacted in so many ways, you know, by upstream contaminants and downstream, you know, withdrawal use and barriers being put up that fish have taken major impacts in Oregon and a brunt of the listings in Oregon. So there's oftentimes an ongoing debate over, I just told you guys that we have 1,600 species under the Endangered Species Act, and we've delisted 50 of them. I'm saying it with a smile on my face and not being like, you know, this looks pretty bad for us. But success is a hard thing to measure under the ESA. And going back to that emergency room analogy, you might say like, well, how many people go to the emergency room and die versus how many people go to the emergency room and are able to make it out versus how many go in to the emergency room and they actually like get all the health care they need and probably don't need to see a doctor again for a long time. And that number, that last number, that's our delisted number, and it's probably pretty small. A lot of the complications, a lot of the threats that put species, fish is what I'll be talking about, but species under the Endangered Species Act happened over a long period of time. And, you know, you think about what the history of the US looks like, of what Oregon looks like, you know, a lot of our impacts to the environment have been happening for 100+ years. And the Endangered Species Act being 40, it is oftentimes easier and quicker to destroy something than it is to rebuild it. And so, we'll be fighting and working on a lot of recovery for a long time for a lot of these species. But in terms of success as preventing extinctions of species, the ESA has been extremely successful. A lot of species were in a nosedive when they were put on the Endangered Species Act, and those quick protections afforded by the Endangered Species Act have been able to, rein in that process of extinction and keep extinction from occurring. And because species haven't been delisted doesn't mean recovery is not occurring either. That, we are seeing major increases in a lot of our ESA listed species in Oregon, although they haven't met that criteria yet for what we might consider recovered. So we oftentimes think, the Endangered Species Act enjoys wide public popularity. And but people oftentimes think in binary terms. It's either it's extinct or it's delisted. And supporters of the Endangered Species Act might say that, yeah, like 1% of the species that have been listed have gone extinct. But critics will also say that, well, yeah, only 3% have actually been delisted. But it's that middle ground that but how's recovery going for a lot of the species put on the list is oftentimes what we should be talking about. And it's what, as biologists and conservationists and land managers, what we're doing, but it's not necessarily the topic of discussion oftentimes. So it's a challenging thing to measure this kind of idea of recovery. It itself is very much a continuum and not a finish line. We can put down thresholds somewhere, but for some species they can feel a little arbitrary. A number of populations over a number of years in a number of areas, it is a hard thing to measure and to know in your heart when something is recovered. And there's a number of species that we have that are going to be reliant on some sort of ongoing management and ongoing conservation from here on out. Two of the species I'll be talking about tonight are like that, that will require some kind of ongoing management well into the future to ensure the habitats are maintained. We do have actions like downlisting of endangered species to signify when a species is kind of reaching hurdles and kind of getting closer and closer to that finish line, and a number of ways of assessing the status of species along the way to see if we're making up ground. So one of the reasons there have been so few delistings, this was made, this HUM acronym was created by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Service lead, Paul Henson, several years ago. And it kind of assessed, well, why are people hesitant to delist species? And one of those is that you lose the regulatory hammer. When a species is listed, you do have some regulations on, on how management can happen of these species, and it gives us some control, over some of that management. Delisting, we lose that regulatory hammer. It's just like any other species out there, oftentimes, and so there's kind of that. Ooh, do we want to give up that? Even though we don't have a ton of control, and typically that is over federal and state agencies, and with our other partners, kind of helping determine what management might look like for habitats. There's also uncertainty, like we're seeing this trend, or we're seeing this number of populations, or we're seeing fewer, say, non-native species in a species habitat. But do we know that's going to be that way in the future? Do we know? We think that models are predicting climate change are going to look like this. Are we sure? Because there's like these error bars on it, and we don't know where it's going to land. And this idea that uncertainty, and we're always going to have some uncertainty in the looking towards the future, and there's always going to be unknowns that may impact species and their habitats. And there's some hesitancy on the part of people who work on these species, and everyone who works on these species, you learn to care about them a great deal. And there's an uncertainty when it comes to saying, like, yeah, we can give up this control and we can delist them. And there's also a financial aspect of it. There's, oftentimes long-term monitoring programs that monitor both the species, the habitat, and lots of other species in the area, or that provide benefits to, say, conservation organizations or land trusts, that as delistings occur, some of that money begins to dry up. And, there's a thought that, like, there's a benefit to, X, Y, and Z along with this species, and we don't want to see this all dry up at this point. So, there's a hesitancy to do delist, or at least we suppose there's a hesitancy to delist because of that financial aspect of it. However, delisting, there's a tremendous amount of positive benefits to delisting as well. And I think many people who work with me look at the ESA as an agreement that we have with the public. And it's an agreement that says we recognize when a species is in critical need of care and critical need of protection, and we will do our best to protect the species and its habitat. When a species is ready to be, it no longer requires that care, that we have an agreement with the public that the species then gets off the Endangered Species Act. And it allows us to demonstrate success and allows us to say, like, yeah, this thing actually recovered and it walked out of the emergency room on its own fins. And it's doing a lot better than it was at one point. It allows us to redeploy our staff and kind of shift money towards species that need it. And it allows us to kind of recognize good science and the conservation of the species, and the 4 species I'll be talking about tonight. The conservation is all driven by scientific information and research programs and monitoring programs, things that happened over a long period of time to kind of build up the notion of what management was working and what management wasn't working, and drive managers towards goals or towards options that were going to be the best for the species. And so it allows us to kind of recognize, like, yeah, this science is the backbone of the work we're doing, and here's how it is successful. It allows us to list species that are in greater conservation need, and it also allows that it's with private landowners. A lot of our work happens on private property. It allows us to, when we come in and deal with private landowners, I'll talk about this in a minute, oftentimes we're saying, like, yeah, help us recover a species, and keeping it on a list is never part of that conversation. We're talking about recovering a species, not simply protecting it. So what are some of the ways we can justify our delistings? You can always relist a species if circumstances change. If new threats come in that are affecting a species, if the decision to delist was incorrect, we can always relist a species. The resources, I said before, that as a way of justifying the delisting, those resources do get put towards species of greater need. And there's the number of species that require help is larger, and the need for money is greater than what is currently available, and it will probably always be that way. But it allows us to move that money and triage where we can and where we need to. There's also, after delisting, a number of actions that we are engaging in to ensure that the conservation steps and the benefits of those species continue long term. And so we don't delist and wipe our hands and say, we're done, see ya, and walk out of there. We're leaving these things, these post-delisting monitoring plans to check on the species over time, well into the future. Oftentimes there's recovery management agreements, and there are oftentimes agreements with state and federal partners, with land trusts, with folks who are going to be, who have a long-term interest in seeing the species managed well, and ensuring that the achievement and the rare achievement of delisting is sustained over time. And so it's we have these agreements with our partners and are helping support them so that they can continue to conserve the species. In Oregon, we've been aggressively pursuing downlisting and delistings when and where they're warranted. And we prioritize our funds for species recovery. And oftentimes the money that we collect in is going out to our partners to do on-the-ground conservation work. We're also extremely proactive at looking at species of conservation risk, and species like lamprey, sage grouse, mussels, things that are maybe not doing hot but don't need the emergency room yet, and saying, like, but you should go see the doctor, and trying to get some of these at-risk species conserved before they require protection under the Endangered Species Act. And basically with the idea that it's easier to proactively target species that are at risk and do conservation towards those species than it would be to list them and go through that whole process. We oftentimes find that our partners are very willing to work with us, and we oftentimes are able to work with larger segment of the public than we would be if a species was listed. So this talk was spurred on, I was asked to develop this with Chris Allen back in July, and it was spurred on by the announcement that we delisted the Borax Lake Chub. And I will talk about the Borax Lake Chub in a minute, but someone with ODFW's Fish Commission had asked, or I guess it's not, it's all one commission. Someone with ODFW's commission had asked us, like, you guys delist the species? Like, that's pretty big news. Can we hear about it? And they had asked, well, Brian, could you put together this talk? And I was like, well, we've never talked about the other 3 species we delisted to the commission. Let's do a talk and talk about like the recent delistings in Oregon, some of the similarities that got us there, because there are a lot of similarities in the delistings and in the species we delisted, and talk about kind of the approach in Oregon we have to delisting species and recovering a lot of these species, and why that's been successful, and kind of ways that we're approaching listed species now. So like I'd mentioned, there had been 4 fish that have been recovered from the Endangered Species Act, and all 4 fish occur in Oregon. So, you know, 50 states, all the territories, US territories around the world, all the listed fish that have been recovered under the Endangered Species Act, all are in Oregon. And that's incredible. And that's my, like, good news, take this home. We can all be proud of that. it's as Oregonians, this is something we all are contributing to. And it's phenomenal that we've been so successful in Oregon in recovering these species. So I'm going to talk about them in order, and I'll probably be talking most about Oregon Chub and the Borax Lake Chub, because I'm an Oregon Chub nerd, and the Borax Lake Chub is the most recent fish delisted, and I've worked probably closest with both of those 2 species. And so anyway, I'm going to dive into it. A common thread to the listing of all these individual species was a loss of habitat, or the degradation or alteration of their habitat. In the Willamette Basin, construction of the Army Corps of Engineers dams, loss of bottomland areas to agriculture, and kind of filling of slough habitats and the simplification of the river system led to an overall loss of habitat. With the Modoc sucker, degradation of stream habitat, especially reaches where the species was spawning by cattle and by other management, other management techniques, was a contributing factor. In areas like Borax, there's been 140-ish years of mining activity at the site to collect borates for making borax soap. And it's an area that's seen long-term human interaction at that habitat and alteration of that habitat. And it's a location that doesn't change a whole heck of a lot over time, as you can see from the 2 pictures there. So I want to talk a bit about Oregon Chub to get us going here. It was ESA listed in '93, and it was the first fish delisted in 2015. And the message I want to drive home here is the power of our partnerships, and the power of partnerships in getting work done. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is a relatively small agency. It doesn't have we're not a huge, as far as number of people go, it's not gigantic. And this is the Oregon Chub Working Group in 2013. And I pull out 2013 of all years because it was at this meeting that we announced that, like, yeah, we had met our delisting criteria, and we started talking about our next steps towards delisting. And it's a pretty small group of people, right? Like, this is if you compare this to the number of people, say, working around the state on Chinook salmon, this is nothing. And it represents land trusts and federal and state agencies. There's folks from cities there, university staff are there, state entities. And so it's a broad swath of folks, of very committed folks. And some of these people who had been working, 20 years at that point on the species, and very committed to this little fish. This group is larger than the working groups for the other 3 species we'll be talking about. So this is all done by very passionate, dedicated people that try to get this work done. And Paul Scheer, who's here in the image, he worked on 3 of the 4 species that were recovered. And the Native Fish Investigations program had worked on 3 of them. So got to plug my old program here. What's not in the image are our landowners. And it's one of the most touching and incredible things to me as a biologist is when we identify a habitat, identify a property, and go out on, I'm gonna play this again because I can. Knock on someone's door and say like, hey, you have habitat that looks like it would be really good habitat for this little minnow that happens to be endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Can I come on your property and take a look for it? And you get a lot of people like looking at you like you're crazy. No, you can't come out and look for the endangered species on my property. But oftentimes these were relationship building events, and people would be like, well, what are you looking for and why are you looking for it? And you get to talking to people, and some of them would say, yeah, you can come out and take a look. And you know, of those, a subset had the species on their property. And you know, it meant building and maintaining these partnerships with people, and you know, some of these landowners, we have relationships going back 20 years that they've been working with us towards recovery, and have seen it since we had, you know, a handful of populations to now tons, and have seen us through the entire recovery process. And it's amazing that people were willing to say yes to helping out with Oregon Chub. About 2/3 of all of our chub populations occur on privately owned property. And so the recovery of the species done in the Willamette Valley, in the most populous area of the state, in areas that are farmed, we have timber producers, we have a lot of just small private landowners who've contributed to the success and the recovery of the species. It blows me away that people were so willing to work with us, and that we were able to be successful with them on the recovery of the species. A lot of this includes work by land trusts. And so the McKenzie River Trust, I call them out, not just because I'm on an MRT call, but they're the only NGO listed on our post-delisting monitoring plan as a partner towards the long-term sustained recovery of the species. And they've, in the McKenzie and elsewhere, have been a tremendous partner in bridging the gap between private landowners and us in making introductions, and in introducing us to habitats that we might want to check out, and just being a supporter. And so, you know, there was a time, and there is a time now, I guess, there's only one full-time staff for Oregon Chub. And it was me, it's Matt Culver, who's on the left-hand side of the image right now with ODFW, who's the only full-time Oregon Chub staff. And which is pretty incredible. But so we rely a lot on our partners, especially our local like watershed councils and tribes, and oftentimes our landowners, the private landowners who own ponds and own sloughs and beaver ponds and everything else. You know, as we work with them and show them that we're dedicated to you know, the species, and to you know, enhancing the habitat on their property, and that we're not the big scary government, that we actually are kind of just nerds for fish, that they became some of our loudest proponents and introduced us to their neighbors and their friends and other people who have similar habitats, and were also willing to work with us. And I am touched that we're able to show them, like, yeah, we said we'd come out here and recover the species, and it took us a while, but we did it. And that's pretty incredible to us. So we've also, a number of people have allowed us to move Oregon Chub and translocate Oregon Chub and introduce them into new habitats. And this is Joe Mole, the executive director of the McKenzie River Trust, moving Oregon Chub into his first introduction pond, the first at Finn Rock, which is in the upper McKenzie. And that was an exciting day for us to introduce Chub into that property that they had worked a long time in purchasing. So interagency collaboration, this idea that we're all kind of small agencies, we're all kind of, we all have limited pools of time and resources, but working together, we can actually accomplish these pretty major objectives, and that all of us bring little special pieces to this pie, that we're maybe the fish specialists, but, you know, with Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, between navigating different aspects of the ESA and providing funding, they bring something else to the pie. The Partners Program for Fish and Wildlife Service brought a lot of technical on the ground pond building and enhancement skills. So everyone was bringing a little bit something else to the picture, and overall, you know, made this a very strong program. Our number of populations, and I include very little data in this whole talk, so just it's what it is. Sorry. But we started out with you know, 8-ish populations Oregon Chub, and in 2019 we have 134, and it's certainly more this year in 2020. 35% of those populations are new since we delisted. And there was a number of landowners that after we delisted, they weren't comfortable working with us when the species was endangered. But once we demonstrated that we were willing to delist the species and that we said we did what we were going to do, we were contacted again by a number of people who were like, you know what, you did it. Like, I'm actually willing to work with you now. And that was awesome that people remembered what we did, remembered the conversations they had with us, and came back and said, like, that was cool. Like, I can respect that, and I actually do want to know what's on my property. And why don't you guys come back out? So these are the bar graphs here show just the number of populations. And the proportions that are black are our introduced populations. So the number of populations that we created through introductions. And some of those were wildly successful. So we've both discovered new populations. We've allowed the fish to kind of recolonize and get into new habitats where it wasn't previously, and found a bunch of new populations, and also put them out elsewhere into the habitats. So. Moving on, I want to talk fairly briefly about Modoc sucker and the Foskett Speckled Dace. These species are kind of in the south central area of Oregon. Modoc sucker both in just the border of Oregon and also in Northern California, and Foskett Speckled Dace kind of down near the Lakeview area, near the corner of California and Nevada. So the Modoc sucker was listed in 1985. It was the second fish delisted in 2015, right after the Oregon Chub. The Foskett Speckled Dace was listed also in 85, and it was delisted in 2019. The big kind of take-home message here is the power of planning recovery of species and then implementing those plans. Both these species had fairly well dialed in either recovery plans that was like, oh, we know what we need to do to get the species to recovered status, but we need to just follow through with this recovery plan and figure out who's going to tackle what, provide resources to these people, and move forward. With Modoc sucker, I mentioned like the cattle grazing in spawning reaches, and it's like, okay, we can exclude cattle from these spawning reaches, we can recover the habitat, we can ensure that landowners have places to water their cattle, so that that we're not necessarily doing an action that's gonna limit someone's utilization of their property. It was also things like excluding non-native fishes from Modoc sucker habitats, and at the time, Modoc sucker, ODFW was moving non-native fish into Modoc sucker habitats to provide fishing opportunities. So it's like, well, hey, maybe we should stop that, and removing non-native fish from the habitats and then putting in barriers to keep non-native fish in. These were outlined in the recovery plan documents. And so it's just implementing these things over time and following through on those implementation plans. With Foskett Speckled Dace, it was opening up, and their habitat was kind of vegetating in, going through vegetative succession and sedimenting in. So over time, there was less and less and less habitat as vegetation encroached upon it. And so opening this habitat up, creating additional habitats, and sustaining this over time through both through the recovery plan and then ongoing with this. We have a cooperative management plan, which is between BLM and Jimmy Liao. With BLM is shown burning out some habitat as a way of removing vegetation from it, but I was going to say, the cooperative management plan between BLM, ODFW, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, which after the species was delisted, and well, heck, even while it was listed, outlined the management that was required to conserve the species, to get it to recovered status, and then to maintain that recovered status long term. And so the idea that making good plans, and these good plans based on sound scientific principles and the best research information that was coming back to us, and then implementing things over time is kind of the take-home message here. Oh, I thought it froze up. It did not. And then finally, the Borax Lake Chub. And I'm going to spend a little time on the species because, hey, it just got delisted. It's like the good thing that happened in 2020. We delisted the Borax Lake Chub. The take-home message here is on follow-through. And it's on an ongoing commitment to conserving these species long-term. And the Borax Lake Chub, the Foskett Speckled Dace are two kind of conservation-reliant species. And they're ones that are going to be reliant upon long-term efforts to maintain habitats. This is the Borax Lake Chub. It doesn't look like much, does it? But it's a really, really cool fish. And I want to talk briefly about the habitat here, and because it's like nowhere else in Oregon. So it's the neatest place. but it's in the Alvord Basin in southeast Oregon. It's just kind of in the shadow. It's a fault block mountain system with Steens Mountains on one side, so it's very impressive being in the Alvord Basin, and it's a fault block, so just like this, and the Steens Mountains are above you, and it's a very neat place to work. Driest area of the state, and this is Borax Lake, kind of heart-shaped or Mickey Mouse shaped, I guess, but north and south run from the north is on the right side of this image, south is on the left side of the image. And it's a 10-acre geothermal hot spring. And it's a mountain built up on 30 feet of dead diatoms and borosilicate deposits. So really kind of fluffy, flocculent, sandy, silty material built up on a mountain, basically. And it has a vent in it, a geothermal hot spring vent, a main one that is in the middle of the image right there. It's dark, and it goes 120 feet down into the below the playa of the Alvord Basin, and down to where it kind of bubbles out of a fault. This spring is the largest of several hundred springs along this fault line that run north to south in the Alvord Basin, and the area, this is the southernmost major spring, and the area down here has more, the fault is kind of wider, and so it has the most flow coming up out of the ground here in this location. So there's the main hot spring that puts out 40-ish seawater, say 100-ish degree water, maybe more than that. I'm not good with my conversion on top of my head, but it's a hot spring putting out very hot water. And there's also cold springs, additional springs. You can see one of them kind of on the corner, on the upper left corner of the lake is a cold spring that is putting out cold water. There's also cold springs around the lake. There's kind of on the bottom edge of the lake here, you can see kind of a dark band. Those are stromatolites, which is like the first thing we have that we can say life existed here. Are stromatolites, and they're like a cyanobacteria. This is where I'm not a specialist, but cyanobacteria that lay down a secretion of calcium and other minerals into little layers. They kind of create these pillows, like living rock pillows of bacteria and algae on a rock, basically. It's a very weird thing, and I'm not describing it very well. I'm a fish biologist, what can I say? Oldest extremophile on Earth, they're found here in Yellowstone, they're found on the Great Barrier Reef, and very few locations have these things. And so it's really cool that they're here in the lake. When you get out to Borax Lake, you're greeted by this sign on one of the first gates you get there. And it says, Borax Lake water is unsafe for human consumption. Arsenic levels are 25 times the critical limit for drinking water. It's like, yeah. And there's life here. It's incredible that they're here in this hot lake, in this arsenic-rich water full of borates. Like I say, they used to mine soap out of the nearby soils, and the water itself, when you put your hands in the water and come out, they're actually kind of slippery with the minerals in the water. It's incredible. The lake itself, this is a video that kind of flows or loops, and you can see what the habitat kind of looks like. You can see that I'm on the edge here of the lake, and that the playa kind of drops down below me. And the lake itself, it was a very cold morning, and the lake itself is steaming because it's so hot, and the wind is whipping across the desert and kind of creating quite a bit of turbulence. So it's a tough system, and this is a hardy fish to be able to survive in the lake. So one of the big things that came up was climate change, and we were planning to delist. With the delisting process, we put out an initial proposal to delist, and then we asked for public comment, and the public came back and said, what about climate change? Like, this thing's at the edge of what we think anything. It's there, like the water's just under what you sous vide fish at to cook and eat fish. Like this is a extreme habitat as is. What happens in climate change? And many of the reviewers came back and said, this is a major risk, and you sure you want to delist? And so we actually went back and did a significant analysis and brought in a bunch of regional climate change models and experts to kind of walk us through those models, and did a deep dive through existing publications and previous work that had been done, previous work that had been done over the 40 years it's been listed. It was listed in the early 80s, and pulled out a bunch of published and unpublished data sets to analyze. And it really increased our knowledge of the contributions that the atmospheric air temperature had on the water temperature, and led us to better understand that no, the drivers for water temperatures during periods that were critical for chub were more likely based on hot water coming out of the hot spring than hot air temperature. The air temperature is likely doing more to cool the lake, and during hot periods, it may be that maybe not happen as quickly, but that it was really the hot water coming out of the spring that was impacting the fish in the population. And so it led to a pretty major change in our proposal to delist and what the final delisting rule looked like, and it kind of changed our direction of the post-delisting monitoring plan and how we're going to monitor that habitat moving forward. So it was a way that the public and peer-reviewed scientists came back and said, like, I don't know if we like this. And so we said, you know what, we hear you, and we can make some significant changes to change both like the thresholds for increasing and changing our monitoring of the species, and change our management of that habitat over time. So overall, it helped support our delisting proposal, though, by the time we were all said and done. This is the abundance of Borax Lake Chub over time, and there's 3 different kind of bar types here, and there's 3 different kind of management strategies or monitoring strategies for getting population abundance in the lake. ODFW had been monitoring this since 2005, and even within this period, we had done 2 different estimate types to kind of estimate the abundance of the lake. But you can see that the abundance, you know, in recent years has been upwards of 80,000 individuals, but has gone as low as 1,200 individuals just several years ago, back in 2015, and that kind of it is die-off, that low abundance event, and the other one that happened in the mid to late 80s were both tied to extreme high water years, basically, and events. And this shows that after those events, the population was able to quickly rebound and rebuild itself despite major losses and relatively low population sizes associated with those events. So with the Borax Lake Chub, like I said, it's this follow through and this idea that once we delist a species, we're not walking away, that we're actually continuing to monitor and maintain these habitats. At one point, you could drive right up to Borax Lake, and there was nothing stopping someone from just driving their car on the lake. And there's a thin crust layer, like a creme brulee, around the lake. And like a creme brulee, a little weight might break it. And there was a lot of concern about vehicle access, about cattle moving in and around the lake, about protecting that crust, and that crust supports the elevation of the lake where it is. If it were to break, the lake elevation drops significantly, and the lake itself is relatively shallow. And so a little drop in elevation of the lake means a lot of loss of habitat. So fencing this habitat was very important, and TNC and BLM kind of co-own 2 different portions of the lake and own the whole thing. BLM manages a significant area around the lake, and when it was initially listed, primarily due to exploration for geothermal development, for power development in the Alvord Basin based on the hot spring. And we, I'm going to say, it was thought at the time that pumping water out for that geothermal power development may kind of limit the water elevation in Borax Lake and may cause the extinction of the species. So maintaining those fences long-term and continue to monitor the species during high water events is going to be something that we do, probably for a very long time to come. So anyway, this is kind of my summary here. The Fish and Wildlife Service in Oregon is willing to accept some of this uncertainty that comes with delisting species in part to kind of demonstrate that the Endangered Species Act is working, and to follow through on that commitment that we have with the public and with our partners to say that once we reach our targets for delisting and once a species is no longer actively threatened, that we are willing to pull back and say, yes, we can reallocate these resources elsewhere. With this, we understand there's a lot of follow through, that our agencies, our partnering agencies, the NGOs, and the other groups we work with, and even our landowners are committed to post delisting management and monitoring long term. And, as a way of reallocating these limited resources we have and making sure that we can conserve as many species as possible. The recovery of the 4 species I'm talking about today was accomplished through the power of these strong partnerships in both state, federal, tribal, with our land trusts, with private landowners. It really wasn't a single agency effort or a single individual effort. It was this group that for each of these species got the work done. It was implementing our recovery plans and both writing really good recovery plans, doing research to fill in the gaps of knowledge where we didn't know how the ecosystem worked, and then implementing these recovery plans to get us to conservation status. I didn't go into it, but we used a number of regulatory tools like our Safe Harbor program, which provides assurances to landowners to allow us to work on their property, and also these long-term cooperative management plans to assure that we can maintain recovery. And yeah, like I say, we have a long-term commitment to conservation of these species, and hope to be able to talk to you about more delistings in the future. So with that, I'm going to leave my email up here, and apparently my boss's email too. Why not? Hopefully you guys have some questions for me. And yeah, thank you so much. I can't hear you, Holly. I think you're still muted.
You would think after so many months, I would know to unmute myself. Thank you so much. I do have a couple questions I'd love to ask you. We have a couple minutes here, so let me read those to you. So the first one is, what can landowners who might not own property that contains or endangered species do to help conservation? So landowners who don't own property that already have them, what can they do?
Well, it tis the season, and so I have to say, get out and vote, and encourage others to get out and vote, and that's very important, to be engaged and to be an engaged voter. Beyond that, being an advocate for endangered species and being and helping promote this kind of conservation work is important, both amongst your circle of friends and people you might know, but also being engaged in, say, local conservation work. And so the work like, say, the McKenzie River Trust does, weed pulls and get outdoors days where they need volunteers. When I was with ODFW, we brought on a lot of volunteers to come out and help us get a lot of this work done, and we're able to really make big strides with people helping out when they were able and in ways that they were able. So it wasn't just necessarily in the field. We've utilized people who are good with writing or good with website design and said, like, I have some free time, what can I do to help out? And it's like, well, actually, we do have this project. And we've oftentimes engaged with students that way. And so there's a lot that people can do, even if they don't own a pond or own a slough or have for the species. So thanks for asking.
Great. Another one here. So these were awesome stories about delistings. You kind of alluded to hopefully more on the horizon. Are there other delistings that you foresee potentially down the line?
Yeah, I'm lucky to work with a lot of really good biologists and people who are, we get into this work because we're all passionate about it. And including the McKenzie River Trust, who's done an incredible amount locally to conserve habitat. But I would say that the Columbian white-tailed deer is making significant strides towards recovery, and we're seeing the population is doing quite well. And I'm not at a place, and I'm certainly new enough in the Fish and Wildlife Service, I can't say anything about like it's going to look like this and it's going to take this long, but I know that they're doing quite well. And same with the Warner sucker, a fish kind of down in the Warner Basin in Southeast Oregon. There's a pretty strong plan in place and really good partnerships that have been built up over a long period of time. They're going to be, I hope they're going to be successful. They look like they're going to be successful. And I could see those being upcoming. And there's a number of other species too. I know there's a number of terrestrial species that are seeing major improvements, especially in the Willamette Valley, but I would screw it up if I started talking about them. But yes, more is happening, and I'm in my own little silo sometimes, but a lot is happening, and I know a number of species are getting closer and closer.
Great. So one last question for you. So there are more iconic or charismatic species out there, sorry, Brian, like the bald eagles or the Chinook salmon, grizzly bears, things like that. How do you connect with people about these like little tiny fish? Like, what do you think the key is to get people excited about a fish they may not have ever heard of or don't really understand their role in the ecosystem?
I look back, it's like Borax Lake, and used to be, you know, Eastern Oregon used to be covered by inland lakes, huge inland seas, basically. And, you know, Oregon used to have camels out in East Oregon and giant sloths and things that I sure wish I could have been there to see. And these have all gone extinct. But the Borax Lake Chub, which was there during that time period, is still here today because it found a spring out in the playa, and it probably didn't look quite the same as it does today, but it was a proto Borax Lake Chub, and we know that because it's related to nearby fish in nearby basins, and it's like it was there back when this was a whole different place, and it has survived here, and it's a relic of that landscape that is so unique and so different. And so there's not a lot of fish in a lot of these habitats. And, you know, Chinook salmon are iconic in Chinook salmon habitats, and Oregon Chub are iconic in swamps and sloughs and backwaters. And they're not like habitats you can get excited about, but they're habitats that are important for the ecosystem. And same thing with Modoc sucker and its habitats. That's what streams look like in that area of Northern California and Southern Oregon. You know, Foskett Speckled Dace is in the Coleman Lake Basin. It used to be a lake that has desiccated down, and now there's springs left over. You know, these cold water springs flowing up and drying out in the playa below. And it's like these are the icons in those habitats because that's all that's left there, and they are unique to that habitat. So while you can't really get I can get excited about all of these. I'm drinking out of an I Heart Chub mug even with a Tui Chub on it. So I get excited about this, and I realize that not everyone's going to be excited about it, but we can be excited about Oregon. And Oregon includes these habitats and include these deserts that used to be something very, very different. And here's what's in them, and here's what's left over. And I think for me, that's the part that I think everyone can get excited about. It's like, well, you can be excited about this because you're excited about Oregon.
So Brian, there's one more question. I'd like to try and squeeze it in, and it might be answer quickly, but the question is, why are upper Willamette Chinook salmon not listed under the ESA? When experts, you know, many experts don't believe that they will survive more than a few decades.
You know, upper Willamette Chinook salmon, are they not listed under the ESA? I thought they are. I thought all of our Chinook are listed under the ESA, and this is where I'm not a Chinook expert, and I'm so sorry. It looks like Becky. I'm asked. There's 185, 187 fish species in Oregon, and I can tell you about so many of them. But unfortunately, my knowledge of Chinook is really like where I say, aren't they listed? And it is a number of my colleagues work on Chinook salmon, a lot of them. And there's a lot up there that there's a lot of challenges, both locally with their habitats, with being able to get through dams, being able to get through the lakes created by those dams and as juveniles, find their way through a habitat that has no flow through it. And then you, as adults, get back above the dams, and the changes in flow and the changes in habitat modifications, changes in temperatures that happens. We have an ocean with changing conditions in it. And it was simpler to recover some of these species that are living in a hot spring because it's one habitat. And we can talk about like it's a harsh habitat, but it's one location. And when it comes to Chinook, and some of these other species, it's like it's not just one location, it's not just one space, it's not one thing. It's like this whole it's a whole thing of sorry, my dog's just howling. It's a whole bunch of competing problems that are and problems that are all kind of stacking one upon the other. That, ooh, we can have a really good ocean survival year, but then come back to the rivers to really poor river conditions, and suddenly it's like, well, you know, or have a really good river conditions and really good, really a lot of juveniles fish leaving the estuary and going out to the ocean to a dead zone, and because of the upwelling that's occurring. And so it's the problems out there are hard. I think that with these small groups of dedicated individuals that were able to recover these species in, you know, with Oregon Chub in the most populous area of the state, with a very highly utilized area of the state, and in some of the harshest habitats we have with, say, Foskett Speckled Dace and Borax Lake Chub, being able to recover species in these habitats shows that we can do it. I think we can do it with everywhere. Yeah, it's you know, with Chinook salmon, it's a very different system. So I'm sorry, I know that doesn't totally answer your question, Becky, but hopefully that gives you some more information to chew on.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, and anyone else?
I think that's it. Brian, I truly appreciate you taking the time tonight to share your expertise with us. That was awesome.
I love talking about these fish and working with you guys. And so yeah, it's my pleasure.
I was reminded, Emily Dickinson wrote in a poem, "Hope is a thing with feathers." And hearing you speak tonight, it makes me feel like hope is a thing with fins, actually. So I do hope all of you out there can join us next week for our final Habitat, which is on blood-sucking vampires or alluring fishes, insights into Oregon lampreys, with Ann Gray from the Fish and Wildlife Service and Ben Clemens with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's a perfect talk for the Halloween season. If you don't know much about lampreys, they're very fascinating, and I hope you can join us. And again, I hope you all have a wonderful evening, what's left of it, and a restorative weekend. And again, thank you, Brian.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you so much. Have a good night.